I'll do a brief recap of some of the main concepts that we touched upon yesterday, and in particular, the ones that have relevance for our session today. In the first session, we discussed the broad nature of Indian philosophy. It's a tradition that lasts, that spans over 3,000 years, from the oldest texts of the Rigveda, composed around 1500 BC, to the commentaries on the Vedic teachings, the latest being around 16th century CE. And this production of knowledge is one that's done in a tradition almost irrespective of the many contributors to these systems. The contributors are eventually joined by compilers or systematizers who sort together all the different additions, subtractions, internal debates, conflicts within all of these schools that originate from the Vedas and those that originate in contradiction to the Vedas or in conflict with the Vedas. There is a certain primacy of the Vedas in the basic characterization of these classical schools of thought, which is that in classical Indian philosophy, there are 9 schools of thought, 3 of which do not accept the authority of the Vedas and are called the Nastika. Nastika and Astika now are considered to be atheistic and theistic. The terms are used in such a sense. But in the classical sense, they're simply those which agree with the authority of the Vedas and those which do not. So there are 3 Nastika schools: Jainism, Buddhism, and Charvak. And there are 6 Astika schools, which are put in pairs because they work in conjunction with each other. One puts forth a certain metaphysics and the other puts forth a certain epistemology or logic. Metaphysics is the theory of being or non-being, what exists, what doesn't exist. Epistemology is that which explains or justifies knowledge, that distinguishes between belief and true knowledge. And the pairs of these Astika schools are Sankhya-Yoga, Nyaya-Vaisheshika, Mimansa-Vedanta. In today's session, we'll be discussing Vedic and Upanishadic thought and briefly taking up the Astika schools and how they either take some of the main teachings of the Vedas forward, or they develop parallel schools of thought that are simply compatible with the Vedic and Upanishadic teaching, or they come up with certain systems of knowledge that are put into question whether they have anything to do with the Vedas at all, but they're still considered to be a part of the Astika school. So, beginning with the Vedas, there are 4 Vedas: the Rigveda, Samveda, Yajurveda, and Atharvaveda. The Rigveda being the oldest, composed around 1500 BC. The Rigveda deals with the hymns to the gods. Actually, when we talk about the Vedas, we basically mean the first part of the Vedas, which are the Samhitas. I will backtrack a little and first describe the structure of the Vedas. Each of the Vedas are divided into 4 parts: the Samhitas, which are the hymns to the gods; the Brahmanas, which are expositions on the hymns, on the mantras; the Aranyakas, which are semi-philosophical, semi-ritualistic exposition. They're the first foray into trying to explain what philosophy underlies the mantras and the teachings of the earlier part of the Vedas. And finally, we have the Upanishads, which is called the cream of the Vedas, the final teaching, the final philosophical inquiry into what the Vedas are truly trying to tell you. The Vedas contained thousands of topics, everything from right living to maintaining a cosmic order, moral order. They contain Genesis stories about the origin of the world. They contain theories of. They don't contain so much so theories of rebirth. It's not pointed to directly, but it's developed, it's teased out from the Vedas. Because the Vedas are composed in a metrical poetic style, they contain dialogues. There will be shlokas, there will be passages that can affirm numerous different interpretations. And that is why there is no self-evident interpretation of the Vedas themselves, which is why these different schools arise in the first place. The Samhitas and the Brahmanas, they form the more ritualistic aspect of the Vedas. The Aranyakas and the Upanishads form the more philosophical aspect of the Vedas. The first part, Samhitas and Brahmanas, they're together called the Karamkand. The Aranyakas and the Upanishads together are called the Gyankand. One of the schools one of the Astika schools called Purva Mimamsa just deals with the Samhitas and the Brahmanas. The Vedanta schools just deals with the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. What they focus on, what part of the text they consider to be authoritative, that differs from school to school. We may find one particular form of philosophy or interpretation out of these to be the most convincing, to be the most representative, but that is by no means self-evident. This is a development that takes place over thousands of years, I mean hundreds and hundreds of years, and finally we have the Vedantic schools that develop from the 8th century CE to about the 16th century CE, and they are considered to be the strongest interpretations of the Vedas, of the Vedic thought. The other schools that coexisted with the Upanishads, with Buddhism, with Jainism, they may have focused on certain aspects of the Vedas, but the Vedantic school is considered to be the true compiler of Vedic knowledge, of Vedic information. So to go back to the 4 parts of the Vedas, the Samhitas and Brahmanas, they form the Karamkand, or the ritualistic aspect. The Aranyakas and Upanishads form the Gyankand, or the knowledge base, the philosophical aspect. The 4 Vedas, the Rigveda, Samved, Yajurved, and Atharvaved. When we talk about the Vedic part of it, the Ved part of it, that is in terms of what the rishis compiled, in terms of what is the truly authoritative, the original authoritative aspect of the Vedas. Those are the Samhitas, the mantras written in certain metric forms. The Rigved Samhita dealt with hymns to the gods. The Samved Samhita dealt with metric and melodic nature of the hymns, and dealt with the musical aspect of the mantras. The Yajurved dealt with other particularities about ritual, and the Atharvaved had spells to promote good health, to succor favor from the gods, to cause harm to your enemies, so on and so forth. So when certain rituals would take place, you would have 3 priests representing the Samhitas from the Rigved, Yajurved, Samved all together, and a 4th priest who would be supervising the activities of the rest. The primacy of the priests was eventually critiqued in the Upanishads. The Upanishads are a part of the Vedas, but they critique the ritualism of the earlier part of the Vedas. So you find that it is not a dogmatic body of philosophy, of speculation. It's a ever evolving, it's a self-critiquing, self-correcting, organically evolving philosophical work. And the Upanishads are considered to be the cream of the Vedas, of the Vedantic thought. There are about 108 canonical Upanishads, or which are considered to be authorless and that deal with the primary content of the Vedas. Though technically there are about 200 Upanishads that are still accepted. Out of the 108, 14 Upanishads are called the Mukhya Upanishads, or the main, which contain the central teachings of the Vedas. And in the Mukhya Upanishads too, there's a loose characterization between the pre-Buddhist and the post-Buddhist. It is said that Buddhist logic and Buddhist epistemology had such a strong impact on the way the Upanishads were composed, that to know the Buddha was to write about the Buddha, as it is said. There was a revolution in thought that took place with the coming of the Buddha. The pre-Buddhist Upanishads, the oldest being the Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya and Mundak Upanishads, these were composed anytime between the 9th to the 6th century BC. The latest ones being just around the turn of the millennia. The pre-Buddhist Upanishads were more dialogic in nature. They were more, they had a lot of rhetorical, a lot of cryptic elements to them. And the post-Buddhist Upanishads became much more direct, much more clear. It's as if the Buddhist injunctions and the premium on clarity that Buddhist teachings had on practical teachings and practical clarity, they started to be incorporated into the Upanishads altogether. So out of the 108 Upanishads, 14 are considered to be Mukhya. And out of the 14 Mukhya, there are some which are pre-Buddhist, some which are post-Buddhist, but their teachings are essentially the same. Before we discuss the Upanishads, we will discuss something about the Vedas more, about the Samhitas more, because certain interpreters like Adi Shankara, who started didn't start, sorry, who systematized the Advaita Vedanta school of Vedanta. Vedanta being the Ant of the Vedas. The Vedantic schools take the Upanishads, which are considered to be the ending portion, which are the ending portion of the Vedas and the ending portion of Vedic teaching, the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras together as the main Vedic teachings. So the Advaita school of Vedanta was started by Adi Shankara in about the 8th century CE, and some of their beliefs include that all the main teachings of the Vedas are found in the Samhitas themselves, that the Samhitas are not just organically evolving in some sense, but they were cryptically hiding their main message from the beginning. This message is, according to Adi Shankara, of monism. Monism being that everything is unitary, that all plurality, all duality, they're only apparent. An example of this is via the treatment of the gods in the Upanishad, in the Vedas. So the gods, they are initially semi-anthropomorphized. They are extensions of natural phenomena. Then they become anthropomorphizations of certain concepts like righteousness and justice. And then something very interesting happens in how the gods are treated. So I will go into that in just a moment. Some of the earliest gods were, like I said, extensions of natural phenomena. Then one of the earliest significant gods was Varun. Varun was the god of heavenly righteousness. Varun was also the arbiter and the maintainer of Rita. Rita is an important concept in the Vedas, which is about cosmic order and moral order together. The conceptualization itself shows that in the Vedic understanding of the world, there is harmony and unity, not just in the cosmology of the universe, but also in its sensitivity to the morality of the universe. There is a moral temper of the universe that maintains the cosmological temper of it as well. And Varun is supposed to be the maintainer of that. Humans are also partly maintainers of that through through how they adhere to ritualism, through the rin that they uphold. Rin is the duties of the human beings. There are 5 main rin. The duty to the gods, the duty to the rishis, and by perpetuating their knowledge, to your ancestors, to other human beings, and to animals. This idea that Indian philosophy, in its quest for salvation, is entirely individualistic is quite false. There is a great ethical component, though it's not the leading component of these philosophies. Unlike in Jainism, which is led by its ethics much more than its metaphysics, but in most of these schools of thought, there is a very strong ethical component that is added to the metaphysical and the epistemological. So the Rita, which is the cosmological order, the cosmic order, and the moral order, the human element of maintaining that is the Rin, the 5 main duties that the humans have. What ethics are upheld by each of these systems also depends upon the nature of the self that they promote. Whether the self is provisional, whether the self is illusory, or whether the self is real. They all have certain ethical, metaphysical conjunctions with that. That even if the self is illusory, it's still subject to dukkha in Buddhism. and that does bring about certain ethical mandates in how you treat your fellow creatures. Give me 1 second. Right. So Varun, being the maintainer of the cosmic order, is given the highest importance initially, and soon Varun's place is taken by Indra. Indra being the god of battles and warfare. The epithets used for Indra are eventually also applied to some of the newer gods like Mitra and Aditi. And this is that interesting movement that I mentioned earlier that you see happening over the Vedas, which is that these gods that seem distinct are eventually being referred to by the same epithets. So the question arises, are these different gods in the first place, or are even the names of the gods eventually pointing to a unity of some sort, a unitary godhead, or a unitary conception of divinity? There are three layers explained. There are three layers conceptualized in the cosmic order of the heavenly layer, the atmospheric, and the earthly layer. In each layer, there are 11 gods. But eventually, a god named Prajapati is introduced, who is said to be the 34th god. So there are 11 in all of the three layers. And the 34th god is Prajapati, who includes all of them, who includes the first 33. So you find this distinction between the different gods eventually move towards a certain unity, a certain monotheism. So the scholar M. Hiriyanna posits that there's an inner movement within the Samhitas, within the Vedas, which is one of philosophical monotheism that then gives way to pure immanent monism. Philosophical monotheism means that the seeming diversity between the different gods is a conceptual diversity that is illusory. It's in a way eventually going to come towards a unity that is the main teaching of the Vedas. So it is demonstrated by unifying the epithets of the gods to eventually creating this lord of all creatures named Prajapati, who is the 34th god but includes the first 33. So were there different gods to begin with at all? That is one of the questions that arises. And for people like for interpreters like Adi Shankara, that diversity was illusory to begin with. This also leads to the question whether the gods were illusory to begin with or not, and different schools of thought interpreted in different ways. For some schools of thought, there are no multiplicity of gods, as we typically understand Upanishadic thought, which is now considered to be part of Hindu religious thought. The term Hindu is a much more modern term. I'm not going to go into the sociopolitics of these terminologies and when the term comes about, but it is a very modern term, and it's taken up due to a certain politics of the time. But when we see in the Bhakti movement, for example, you have the Vaishnavites, the Shaivites, who also believe in the authority of the Vedas, but choose to focus on certain aspects of it. They're quite in conflict with each other. There is no clear-cut umbrella movement that unifies all of them, even if they adhere to certain texts that they all agree upon their validity, their authority. So in the Vedas, you see this movement from naturalistic gods to anthropomorphized concepts to an eventual unity of the Godhead. This movement towards a unity is what the Upanishads focus upon as the true teaching of the Vedas, that the seeming plurality is a form of Maya or avidya. The term Maya, as we understand it as illusion, is also a later interpretation. Maya is used mostly as avidya in the Vedas, or ignorance. That it's a form of ignorance. It's a form of plurality that is as eternal as the true reality that lies behind it. More on that in a moment. The world of the gods, of human beings, of what's called the empirical realm, this is eventually appended to show that there is a greater reality that lies behind it, that reflects this world that we are able to perceive. But it is this world that we are able to perceive is not the real world. It's that which holds us uh, bounded due to ignorance, and liberation is something to be found via knowledge. So one of the things I mentioned in the last session was that the classical Indian philosophy, especially the Astika schools, and two of the Nastika schools, Jainism and Buddhism, they are goal oriented in a sense. They are looking at a doctrine of salvation, that ignorance binds and knowledge liberates. Ignorance of what kind and knowledge of what kind, that differs from school to school. But it is ignorance that binds and causes individuals to be part of the cycle of birth, death, rebirth. And it is knowledge that will blow out that candle. That flame that flickers constantly is blown out once you're able to understand the true reality. This understanding of the true reality, whether it leads to immediate salvation or salvation after death, again, that is something that is interpreted differently in the different schools. So, Jivan Mukti is that which occurs after you understand the true reality. Videha Mukti is the absolute freedom from rebirth that takes place after you pass away. Similar to the example given by Adi Shankara is one similar to a potter's wheel, that even after the potter stops rotating the wheel, it'll keep rotating for a while due to its inner momentum. And that is to say that even if you understand the true nature of things, you might still have to live out this life to attain full freedom after you die. And your purpose as an enlightened being is to help other people gain enlightenment. So in some schools of thought, there is a focus on attaining enlightenment and then spending the rest of your life to help other people attain enlightenment. This is in fact the highest goal of an individual in Mahayana Buddhism, to be a bodhisattva, that after you attain enlightenment you help others also attain it. So to go back to this movement towards oneness in the Vedas, you see that there are different gods who have their own domains. Those domains start blending together, and eventually a god named Prajapati is introduced. And it is said that there are 33 gods, 11 in each realm. The 34th god is Prajapati, who includes all of them. Prajapati becomes a particularly interesting concept, a representative of the unity, the consciousness that is representing the unconscious true reality that lies behind the empirical reality. This distinction between the conscious true reality and the unconscious true reality is also a major point of conflict and difference in the Vedas, in the Vedantic school. Sorry, the Sagun Brahman is the Brahman that has the qualities, that has infinite qualities, and the Nirgun Brahman is the Brahman that lies behind that Brahman with the qualities. This Nirgun Brahman has no qualities. It's only to be understood via negation, via removing all possible understandings of what qualities can be, because it is beyond all perception, it is beyond all understanding, because an object can be understood, but it is not an object. It is that which creates subjectivity and objectivity. This idea that Brahman, that true reality creates subjectivity and objectivity, is challenging the very limits to which the intellect can conceptualize any concept. We can think about things in pairs of black and white, of existing and non-existent, but to be something that is beyond that, to be beyond the existing and non-existing, to be beyond black and white. That is to say that the limits of cognition, the limits of the intellect, are inscribed in the understanding of reality. So reality, the true reality that is taught by, that is professed in the Vedas and the Upanishads, is one that requires the intellect to lead you to a certain point, but the intellect has to be in a way abandoned for direct intuitive experience to understand reality. The direct intuitive experience is again taken up in different ways in different schools of thought. Yoga in particular is looking at this direct intuitive experience via meditation to say that there is a certain movement inwards that helps remove the different layers of ignorance and avidya that the consciousness is afflicted with. So we through the gods we find this movement towards oneness, and this oneness, the realization of this oneness is the true teaching of the Vedas. This is the main interpretation of the Vedantic school. The Astika concerns with different elements of knowledge, of understanding how to experience that direct intuitive experience. If knowledge is to bring about the true liberation, then there needs to be a system of differentiating knowledge from falsity or belief from true knowledge. So that leads to a great development of epistemology and logical schools in the Astika schools. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge, like I mentioned, and logic is the theory of necessary connection between premises and conclusions, or how to deduce a knowledge, a claim that constitutes knowledge from certain premises. This leads to a great development of epistemology, and epistemology then calls for the different categories of right cognition. I will go into these categories in a little more detail shortly, but to just highlight them so that you keep them in your mind first, and it like a layer of paint, it can establish itself a little more concretely later on. The six categories are perception, which is pratyaksh; inference, which is anuman; comparison, which is upaman; shabda, which is testimony; arthapatti, which is postulation or forming a hypothesis; and anuplabdhi, which is non-apprehension. It is through these pramans, or these means of valid cognition, that the different schools of thought carry out their epistemology. Some accept two of these, some accept four of these pramans, but there is this premium put on true knowledge, and true knowledge calls for an understanding of what constitutes right cognition from wrong cognition, what constitutes the very understanding of language and how premises can lead to conclusions. So this soteriology, this doctrine of salvation, that you are freed via true knowledge, it necessarily breeds these great treatises on epistemology and on logic. So this idea that Indian philosophy only deals with metaphysical claims and is only spiritual, is only religious, is thus a very short-sighted interpretation of what is truly going on in these schools of thought. So to go back to the Vedas and to conclude the Vedic portion, and then to move on to the Upanishadic portion, the Samhita portion, and to move on to the Upanishadic portion, there is this imminent movement towards oneness. The philosophical monotheism is one that is developed over the Vedas, and some would argue that it was the true teaching of the Vedas from the beginning. In the Nasadiya Sukta that we talked about yesterday, the very hymn of creation, the very genesis of all creation, is one in which the gods are shown to not know perhaps what caused creation to begin with. So this idea that the monotheism or monism develops later on, many would critique it and say that it was always there, but it was taught in a cryptic, in a riddled sort of way, because the teaching of the Vedas is not that which unconceals itself right away. When Indra in the Chandogya Upanishad, one of the oldest Upanishads, goes to Prajapati to understand the nature of consciousness, the nature of the self, the first thing Prajapati says to Indra, who is the supreme god at the time, is to go and meditate for 32 years before you're considered to be to be worthy of being imparted this knowledge. So this idea of hidden knowledge, of knowledge which is not imparted right away, is also a part and parcel of the teachings of classical Indian philosophy. The Gurukul system also originates from this. Going back to the timeline of the Vedas and the Upanishads, the earliest Vedas are composed around 1500 BCE to about 800 BCE. The Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, they soon follow, and the Upanishads, which are the cream of the philosophical thought, they are composed between 8th century BCE to the turn of the millennia. There are 108 Upanishads, out of which 14 are considered the Mukhya Upanishads. They take this movement towards oneness as the true teaching of the Vedas, and then take it forward to show that everything else is superfluous, and that which helps this understanding of oneness is the only thing that we should focus on. The six Astika schools don't necessarily consider this to be the priority of their teaching. The Sankhya-Yoga school, for example, the Sankhya school, for example, is dualistic. It does not even talk about Atman as of such, the Brahman Atman binary that is actually a unitary, that I will go into in a moment, that the Vedantic school sees to be the true teaching of the Vedas. Adi Shankara, in fact, of the Advaita Vedanta school, would say that the Sankhya school, the Sankhya being the oldest of the Astika schools, was perhaps not even a derivative of the Upanishadic teachings. It may have developed in a parallel fashion by simply adopting some of the main concepts from the Upanishads, but should not be considered to be a continuation of Upanishadic teachings, or even an exposition of Upanishadic teachings. So there's a great amount of internal conflict within these different schools of thought, not just between the Astika and the Nastika, but even within the Astika schools. So Adi Shankara would consider the Sankhya school to be the greatest opponent of the Advaita Vedanta school, because the dualism that it propounds. The Sankhya school is also atheistic. It believes in the law of karma, and as of such says that the gods are then left superfluous. If the karma theory is something that is self-sustaining, is independent of the gods and the will of the gods, then why do we need the gods to begin with? Their metaphysics explains the universe in a certain way, explains creation in a certain way, and liberation in a certain way, but is still adhering to the Vedas, considering them to be authoritative, while their views can be in conflict with, say, the main Upanishadic teachings. So this internal conflict, mutual influence, is to be found through all of the schools of Indian thought, of Indian philosophical thought. After the Buddhist teachings become popular in these circles of debating and discussing the different philosophies, especially in the courts of kings, so that your school of thought can be adopted, and that becomes the default belief system of the region. There were these different schools of thought would be vying for power that way. Buddhism was, in fact, the most dominant school of thought in India till about the 12th century AD. Which is 12th century CE, and afterwards you find that it goes towards the south in the Theravada school, and it goes towards the north. Towards the south, it reaches Sri Lanka, Burma, Cambodia, and from the north, it goes via Tibet to China, Japan, and the like, and virtually vanishes from India as a robust philosophical system. But for the longest time, there's this great discord and discourse between all of these different schools. They're vying for power, and there is a great internal conflict between the Astika schools as well as the different Nastika schools. This imminent movement towards oneness, it lets go of the godly conceptions altogether. Eventually, even Prajapati is replaced by the concept of Purusha. And Purusha is considered to be the conscious manifestation of the true reality, which is Brahman. So now we start coming across these terms: Brahman, Purusha, Atman, Avidya. And they are then taken up as the primary philosophical teachings of the Vedas in the Upanishads. The 14 Upanishads teach these same concepts in different ways, and in doing so are trying to elaborate upon the different means of understanding this true knowledge, as well as differentiating between prama, which is true knowledge, and aprama, which is false knowledge. Brahman as the ultimate source of the outer world, and Atman as the ultimate source of pure subjectivity. The final movement in this goal towards oneness, in this philosophical movement towards monism, is to eventually equate the Brahman, which is the absolute reality that is objective, with the Atman, which is the absolute reality which is subjective, that lies behind consciousness. We will again go into that in a moment once we take up the Upanishads. At this point, I want to take a short break to ask you all to take up questions, and if there's anything you would like me to clarify from what is covered so far. Um, but before you do so, the main things you have to consider is this immanent movement. Um, the Vedic thought is so far not fleshed out for its philosophical content. That is taken up in the Upanishads, but the later commentators like Adi Shankara and all would say that these main concepts were already present in the Samhitas. The Upanishads may clarify them, but the Vedic teaching itself was of oneness. It showed a kind of plurality in a way to test the reader, and to test the one who's investing themselves into the quest towards true knowledge. But within the riddles, within the different dialogues, there was this immanent movement, and that was inevitable. So oneness as the true teaching of the Vedas is the conclusion of the Vedantic schools. But whether all reality is one, whether the world that is apparent can be considered real or Maya, whether if the reflection of Brahman is considered to be empirical, then what is its status, what is its ontological status, whether it's real, Maya, unreal. These are the different points in which the Vedantic schools also differ, but what they agree upon is that the absolute reality is one of absolute unity. So please do ask me any questions and clarifications. We will be taking a 5-minute break before we reconvene.
Yeah, if anyone wants to ask questions, you can raise hand through this reactions column, I presume. Yeah, there is an
Mhm.
option to raise hand when you click there. All right. Meanwhile, everyone is before anyone raises their hand, I'd like to ask one clarification. Asad, you said that okay, Mimansa-Vedanta was a monist school and Sankhya-Yoga
Mhm.
was a dualist school, right?
Mhm.
But what is the nature of Nyaya-Vaisheshika? Like, what are their beliefs with respect to duality of existence?
So Nyaya-Vaisheshika are a realist school. They believe in the reality of all different substances. They consider the consciousness or the soul to also be a substance. So they have a pluralism in them, and as such, don't adhere to the monism of the Vedantic teaching. The monism that seems to be the self-evident teaching of the Upanishads is not in fact self-evident. It's a later interpretation. In all these different schools, they're taking up the different components, such as if you need to if true knowledge is the goal of Vedic teaching, then true knowledge means a categorization of reality first. And in the categorization, the Nyaya-Vaisheshika school considers these different elements to be real rather than Maya. So the individual souls are considered to be real substances or real categories.
Right. So they're pluralist, basically. Nyaya-Vaisheshika.
There's a pluralist realism.
Sarvagya, I can't find the option to raise hand. Yeah, yeah. Okay, if you can't find the option, just type it in the chat box. Yes, Sarvagya, you can speak.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. I just wanted a clarification on the point. Like, if there is a lot of emphasis given on the fact that all the teachings of the Vedas, like they move towards a concept of unity.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to know. So, do they have any content or any philosophical teachings on the Maya aspect? Like, are we to like completely deny the existence of all pluralism, or there is some importance attached to the pluralism, and there is like some importance given to that also in the texts?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. The pluralism that appears initially, its clarification as being simply Maya is a very later interpretation. So Maya as a term is used most so by Adi Shankara in the 8th century CE. Maya is a term that appears in the Vedas as avidya or as a form of ignorance, but isn't used in terms of it being an illusion so much so. That is what Adi Shankara teases out of the Vedas to say that no, that is how it is in fact being said. That the pluralism is there, but when we talk about Maya, that is undermining the pluralism. The pluralism was only seeming or only apparent. So for some, this can seem like an inner contradiction, but for other readers, it is that the very limits of language require you to apprehend the world as it appears, and then also apprehend its unreality. So Maya is something that undercuts or undermines the pluralism that is also present. Some of the schools take that pluralism to be real, but the concept of Maya as illusion is taken up in the Advait Vedanta school of Adi Shankara. The Advait Vedanta school had its precursors, had many people, had many rishis and scholars who were commenting on these elements before, but it was Adi Shankara who truly systematized it. And the concept of Maya is stressed upon the most by Adi Shankara. The other schools of Vedanta, such as Vashishtadvait, which is qualified monism of Ramanuja, the Dvait of Madhvacharya, they disagree with this concept of Maya. They say that no, there is a unity of Brahman as a true unified eternal whole, but the present world, the empirical world, is also real. So there is an internal contradiction, not a contradiction. There's internal conflict in interpretation.
All right, thank you so much. And sir, you talked about epistemology and the branches associated with it. Started from Pratyaksh and Anuman. Could you please
Hmm.
repeat the other aspects? So I was just trying to note it down, and I missed out on that. Can you?
Right, right. No, absolutely. So these pramans, the six pramans were identified in the Purva Mimamsa school. The Purva Mimamsa school dealt with the Samhitas and um, the Brahmanas, which are the Karamkand, and they weren't as interested in the Upanishadic aspect of the Vedas altogether. That was taken up in the Vedantic school. So the Purva Mimamsa and the Vedantic schools are usually paired together because they deal with the Karamkand and Gyankand together. And the Purva Mimamsa school identifies the six main valid modes of cognition. These six modes of cognition are taken up in different degrees, in different numbers by the different schools. They then are pratyaksh, which is perception; anuman, which is inference; upman, which is comparison; arthapati, which is postulation; anuplabdhi, which is non-apprehension; and shabd, which is testimony. So pratyaksh, anuman, upaman, arthapatti, anuplabdhi, and shabd. Some of the schools would reduce Upman and Arthapatti to Anuman itself. They would say that inference is, in fact, the greater mode of cognition, and you can reconceptualize Upman and Arthapatti as forms of inference. And in these inquiries, you find great elaborations on logic and epistemology. So the logical school of Nyaya, it it forms these connections between premises and conclusions in a five-part syllogism. Um, and how I'm not going to go into the logical details of it because that would be too large a digression. But in the Aristotelian syllogism and in the Nyaya syllogism, there are three terms: the minor term, the middle term, and the major term. And just in terms of how the middle term can cause errors, it's called hivtabhas. Hitvabhas. There are 9 different errors that are laid out as logical errors that can take place when you're trying to form a conclusion out of certain premises. So Hetvabhas, or the error of the middle term, is it appears in 9 different ways. So that is to say, there is a great focus on language as the means to knowledge, since it is via language that we are able to systematize the workings of the intellect. But the workings of the intellect can only get you so far. After that, there is a direct intuitive experience that is the only thing that can get you true knowledge of the Atman, the Brahman, or whatever these different schools posit to be true knowledge. So there is a great focus on what knowledge can be, what epistemology and logic can do for attaining true knowledge. But there is also a limit of knowledge of the intellect circumscribed into these different schools. So that direct intuitive experience is typically understood as one via meditation. And the Ashtanga Yoga system of yoga lays that out. That is something I will go into when we discuss the Upanishads and some of the Astika schools momentarily.
What did you say regarding
Thank you, sir.
Anuplabdhi, Asad?
Anuplabdhi is non-apprehension.
What does
It's
that mean?
So it is non-apprehension. It is the absence of apprehension of something. So if there was an item that was present on the ground and then it is removed from the ground, then you have a non-apprehension of that item, and there is an inference that the absence of something is also pointing towards the knowledge of that thing. In fact, in the Vaisheshika school, there are 4 different types of abhav, or non-existence. There is the non-existence of something that is yet to exist. There is the non-existence of something that has been destroyed. There is the non-existence of something that is of a false hypothesis, such as a square circle. And there is a non-existence of something that is mutually incompatible with its the subject and the predicate. So there are great elaborations on how knowledge can be incorporated via the different pramans and within language. But at the same time, despite this great exposition of language and knowledge, the human intellect, there is also the limits of the intellect circumscribed within these same systems.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting.
It is it's fascinating.
AD, please.
Hello, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
I have a twofold question on this. So it is often said that in Hindu mythology there are 33 crore gods. So is it an exaggeration of the statement that there are 11 gods in each of the 3 layers, with Prajapati or Brahma being the head god or the king god? So is it an exaggeration of that statement?
So
And my second,
yeah, please, I'll answer both together. So, sorry to interrupt. This is your second
No,
question.
thank you, sir. Yeah, my second question is that you said that it developed from naturalistic God to anthropological concepts and then to unity. So, is it because of the influence of tribal culture that there was naturalistic gods in the beginning, but
The
as
influence of
and
what
when
culture? Tribal culture, did you
tribal
say?
cultures,
Right.
tribal cultures or indigenous cultures of India.
Mhm.
So, and when the tribal cultures, their influence started declining, so the concept of gods even started changing. So.
Right. So the great multiplicity of gods comes to us mostly from the Puranas, the Puran. The Puran and how they conceptualize the gods. Oftentimes, the gods are different versions of the same god. One god may appear in thousands of different incarnations. These come to us mostly from the Puran, but in the Vedas, there are typically only 33 gods. And the 33 are 11 for each of the 3 layers of existence. The Puran come out, they are derived from the Vedas. They are often taking up certain elements of the Vedas, but they really begin the whole mythology that is later on called Hindu mythology. That is, we don't typically even take up the gods of the Vedas in worship as well. Like, one does not really hear about worshipping the goddess Aditi or the god Mitra or the god Varun. Like, they're considered to be the old gods. The Puran gods are considered to be the new gods, and they're often they're often considered to be the embodiments of certain key concepts, like the concept of the creator, the maintainer, the destroyer. In some conceptions, the creator, maintainer, destroyer are only one god with three different names. In some conceptions, there are actually three different gods, and so on and so forth. But that mythology comes later on. And to answer your other question about the tribal cultures and the gods that exist there, we have to remember that the Vedic teachings were in Sanskrit, and the sociopolitics of Sanskrit meant that they were not yet accepting the indigenous beliefs so much so as simply incorporating like the naturalism within the old Vedic Aryan culture. The incorporation of the tribal gods as simply manifestations of the gods from the Hindu pantheon of Hindu mythology, that comes much later on. Initially, it is secluded to just the Vedic teaching, and the naturalism is within the Vedas of natural phenomena. That is very quickly shifted to the gods as certain concepts, gods of righteousness, gods of war. We kind of take this for granted that the Vedic gods are considered to be the old gods, and we don't really consider them or in worship or in philosophical speculation as much, because the Purans, the Bhakti movement, they take up certain gods and certain concepts, and the whole mythology pantheon really expands from those movements in the 10th century and onwards. 8th century, I
Okay.
believe, 8th century CE onwards.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And
Sir, if I could continue on this, sir, relating to this question regarding 33 crore gods, so I read this somewhere, and I think that this is the best time to just confirm it. If you could just tell me if it's true, that there was like the word koti, which is used in Sanskrit as the word for crore, and also the word koti in Sanskrit is used for type. So I read this somewhere that what the literal text mean was 33 types of God, and the translation that took place, it translated to 33 crore gods. So I've just read this somewhere. If you could just confirm it, like if it's true or if it's like some, if you could just elaborate.
I am actually not aware of this particular issue of translation, but that's very fascinating. It does seem to be quite plausible, because the 33 gods mentioned in the Vedas are 33 types, 33 concepts, 11 per layer of the three layers, and the later incorporation of indigenous and tribal gods can seem like a natural extension of the number, that it may have been 33 in number and they became 33 crore in number, but it being still 33, it does seem to hint towards a mistranslation taking place, and that's very interesting. I'll look into that as well. I don't know.
if you
Thank
allow
you.
me to intervene, I mean, a sort of observation. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Professor, you are.
I mean, the intervention is when we are talking about 33 crores, and when we talk about the numbers, one intervention is that this is the politics developed after the Buddhism. So therefore, Indian philosophy, when we have to pick
Absolutely.
a pure philosophy in the context of before Buddhism, and after Buddhism, we had seen the political philosophy more than the philosophy. So therefore, the later texts have, as you are suggesting, so it started revolving around three important gods also later on. So that we revolves around Vishnu, Shiva, and so the three becomes the crucial one. So idea of this 33 crore and the issue related to its interpretation is actually a sort of new phenomena, and recently developed in past 5 to 6 years only, you can say. keeping in mind the politics of India. So because we are from law background, we are a law university, so we also have to keep this in mind that there are two ways of working of philosophy in a contemporary times works and any time rather. So event one can define that in the sense of event or phenomenology also, that a politics of a time defines the religion, defines the philosophy also. So in the present context, the moment you will start reading the old philosophies, you're certainly going to find the new interpretation given by the new philosophers. So they will try to come up with these type of philosophy that language should be read in this way or in that way. So somehow we have to refine ourselves from that debate also.
Absolutely, sir. That's a very, very important point, and that's in fact also what the French sociologist Michel Foucault talks about as the genealogical method of doing history. That we
True.
begin with the tools that we have now, but we must always be aware that the tools have developed over times, that certain concepts have sedimented, and we have to rework, we have to reverse engineer our understanding of history. If we assume that our present concepts are neutral and we can simply transport them to the past, then we are simply transporting present prejudices and political developments onto a past where it might not have existed in the same way. So the sociopolitics begin with Buddha. They were there since the beginning, and they begin with they ramp up with the Buddha in the very clear example that Buddha was attempted to be presented as one of the avatars of Vishnu. Like that's a clear example of co-option, and this
Absolutely right.
politics is seen throughout. We discussed the immanent monism that takes place in the Vedas. It's demonstrated in how the gods are treated, and they eventually the epithets start to blend into one. Then the concept of Prajapati as the 34th god that includes the rest is introduced. Prajapati is then replaced by Purusha. Purusha as the god that is not a god, it's the representation of the consciousness of the Brahman, and the Brahman is now introduced as the supreme source of all creation. Now the terms Brahman, Atman, and Avidya, they become particularly important as they're now stressed upon in the in the Upanishadic teachings. The Upanishads can be divided into the pre-Buddhist and post-Buddhist as a loose categorization, because after Buddhist logic starts to be known, there's almost a pressure on the Upanishadic teachings to become more clear, to become more direct. And I want to read out a section from the Ish Upanishad that that holds a lot of elements that resemble Buddhist teachings, and as of such have been often considered to be a result of the influence of Buddhism. One of the ideas in Buddhist in Buddhist the journey towards knowledge and the journey towards letting go of the ego and understanding the illusory nature of the self. One important concept is to neither hold on to ignorance nor to hold on to learning. In the later Japanese Zen Buddhism, this is explained through what is called Satori Awakening. And it is said that Satori Awakening, which is a sudden enlightenment, it is said that he who has Satori Awakening, he who holds on to Satori Awakening, is shot through hell like an arrow. So the goal that they're trying to achieve is also one which condemns the individual. And this itself is a riddle to show that if you believe you have an enlightenment and you hold on to it, you have again grasped a certain intellectual development and fallen back into the pitfalls of desire and ego. So some of these can be seen in the Ish Upanishad, which is also one of the older Upanishads. It's considered to have originated around the time of the Buddha or just after. It's only 18 sections. It only has 18 sections. It's basically 2 pages long, and according to some, it's the cream of the Upanishadic thought in its most cryptic form. So a part of it goes. I'm reading just the middle section. It moves, yet it does not move. It's far away, yet it is near at hand. It is within this whole world, yet it's also outside this whole world. When a man sees all beings within his very self, and his self within all beings, it will not seek to hide from him. When in the self of a discerning man, his very self has become all things, what bewilderment, what sorrow can there be regarding that self of him who sees this oneness? He has reached the seed, without body or wound, without sinews, not riddled by evil. Self-existing and all-encompassing, the wise sage has dispensed objects through endless years. And the next two in particular can remind one of the nature of Buddhist teachings. Into blind darkness they enter, people who worship ignorance, and into still blinder darkness, people who delight in learning. It's far different from knowledge, they say. Different also from ignorance, we are told. So we have heard from wise men who have explained it to us. Knowledge and ignorance, a man who knows them both together, passes beyond death by ignorance, and by knowledge attains immortality. These seeming paradoxes are paradoxes of language, are paradoxes of understanding. That in the Nasadiya Sukta, when the very nature of creation is told to have existed at a time when there was neither being nor non-being, it's pushing the limits of human reason to also understand that human reason alone cannot conceptualize these concepts. These concepts are not objects to be conceptualized. One of the main teachings of the Upanishads is that the Brahman, which is the objective side of the same reality, as the Atman, which is the subjective side of the same reality, are not objects of apprehension or comprehension. They are that which create objectivity and subjectivity to begin with. So the Brahman is now introduced as the great source of all creation, but the Atman, which is the human, which is the self that lies behind human consciousness, or the self that lies behind any understanding of consciousness, the human consciousness, animal consciousness, they're simply layers of consciousness, and human beings have a certain privilege of having self-awareness, self-consciousness, a certain intellect that can lead to understanding the limits of knowledge. It's a certain anthropomorphization that privileges human beings, but it's not to say that consciousness does not exist in animals, in other forms in the world, but the kind of consciousness that exists in human beings, that is closest to that which can understand pure consciousness that lies behind this consciousness. An example given in the Katha Upanishad, which is a similar example given in Plato's Phaedrus, is that of the chariot. The body is equated with the chariot. The horses are the senses. The reins are the mind. The charioteer, the intellect. The road in front of you is the object of apprehension, the object which is the empirical world. The charioteer is the intellect, remember. But the master of the chariot is the self, or the Atman, which stays unaffected, simply witnessing in the back of the chariot. And the charioteer, which is the mind, which is engaged in the field of action, forgets that the master sits at the back. Another example that we talked about yesterday was in the tree of Jeev and Atman from the Mandukya Upanishad, that there are two birds that fly together, eat together, sleep together, but it is one that is eating, flying, and sleeping, and it is the other which is simply witnessing the one eat, fly, and sleep. The riddle here is also that it's not simply a duality of the self. It is a special kind of consciousness. It does not need to eat, sleep, or fly about. It can do without these things that a typical creature would need to sustain itself. It's simply there to witness, because that is its nature. It is pure subjectivity that can never be an object. It can never be apprehended as an object. The Atman, which is the pure consciousness that lies behind our levels of consciousness, our levels of awareness, is this pure subjectivity which cannot ever be an object of consciousness. That is why language, knowledge, uh, the workings of the intellect cannot lead one to understanding this pure consciousness. The Vedas are supposed to be simply a means via language to conceptualize what it may be, what the Atman may be, what the Brahman may be, but to apprehend them, it has to be a matter of direct intuitive experience. And that is taken up in particular by the Yoga school. In the Chandogya Upanishad, when Indra, the king of the gods, and Virochan, the king of the Asuras, they go to Prajapati to understand the nature of the self. It's the nature of the self and the nature of consciousness is a recurring theme in the Upanishads, as all of these main concepts of the Brahman, Atman, and pure subjectivity of the Atman are. So Prajapati, after a great deal of back and forth, he sends Indra away to meditate for 32 years, then comes back, gives Indra a particular answer about what consciousness is. Indra is dissatisfied. Virochan is satisfied and leaves, but Indra asks another question. Then Prajapati sends him again for further contemplation. And in this entire discourse, what comes about is that consciousness is understood in 4 layers. The first consciousness is that of the waking state. This is the state that we are most familiar with, but it's an unstable state, and it does not tell us any truth about the nature of consciousness that perhaps may be shared by all people. One view is that you can simply believe that consciousness exists differently in different individuals, and that's the end of it. But in understanding what consciousness is in and of itself, that is the true knowledge, the truth that Indra is seeking from Prajapati in the Chandogya Upanishad. The second conceptualization is it's the same as the consciousness in your dreaming state, but that is also considered to be unsatisfactory. The third is that it is the consciousness of your dreamless state. But then Indra argues that state may do away with the subject-object duality, but it also does away with all apprehension, all experience. And to say that that consciousness is a form of non-experience or a non-existence also does not seem to be a correct conceptualization of consciousness. So the 3 states are Jagrat. So far, they're Jagrat, which is waking, Swapna, which is sleeping, and Susupti, which is dreamless deep sleep. But Indra is not satisfied with these explanations of what consciousness could be, and asks Prajapati for the final time that this too is unsatisfactory. So you're still withholding the truth of consciousness for me. And at that point, Prajapati says that consciousness cannot be that of the dreamless deep sleep, because there is no positive content there. There is a removal of subject-object duality, but it is like an unconscious death of some sort. Consciousness requires an experience of some positive content, because it is a witnessing, an active, a purely present, pure consciousness, pure truth. And as of such, the Turiya state, which is the last state of consciousness, is that which is equated with the Atman. So in this movement towards monism, towards monotheism, the understanding of true reality is not via any understanding outwards, but an understanding inwards. When one understands this pure consciousness that lies behind our apparent consciousness, then one finds that it is equal in every living being, that it is equal to the Brahman, which is one of pure subjectivity and the source of all creation. This is the way Atman is conceptualized in the Vedas as being equal to the Brahman. That once you understand the Atman, you have understood the Brahman and you become the Brahman. It is to say that the mode of understanding is equal to becoming. So knowledge, the journey to true knowledge is also the journey to salvation, because once you know the Brahman, you become the Brahman. And this is via an introspective process. The Brahman may be a supreme reality outside of you, but its conscious manifestation is within all living beings. That conscious manifestation hides behind, or it's behind our apparent consciousness. And once we are able to apprehend that via direct intuitive experience through certain meditative practices, that is how you understand the true consciousness, that is the witnessing self behind the charity, or behind all our understandings of what the self can be, that is full of multiplicity, full of difference, but the unity that lies behind it is equal to the unity of the Brahman. So teaching of the Upanishads in this Advait, in this monist sense, is that the Brahman is equal to the Atman. They're used, in fact, interchangeably. The Atman is the true self that lies behind the Atma, or the individual self. That is a matter of illusion, or Maya, in certain interpretations, like in Advait Vedanta. Now, in Advait Vedanta, Maya is neither real nor unreal, but it exists as old as the Brahman itself. Because the question would arise that if the Brahman is self-sustaining, if it's non-differentiated, if it's eternal, then why does it lead to Maya in the first place? In the Advait Vedanta school, that would simply mean that Maya has to exist eternally along with Brahman, and is simply a reflection of the Brahman's undifferentiated state, but presented through differentiation. In the Advait school, this Maya is illusory. In the Dvait school, the Brahman is actually manifesting itself as the real world. So what certain Western interpreters call panentheism, that there is an empirical and a transcendental, that is in a way the Dvait interpretation of Brahman, that the empirical realm is real and the transcendental realm is also real. In the Advait Vedanta school, it's the transcendental realm is the only thing that can be called real in a sense, but everything else is provisional. It's Maya. It's an avidya because of the superimposition of Brahman's characteristics into the empirical realm. We have to navigate our way through Maya to understand that there is a unity that lies behind it. And in understanding that unity, one is able to apprehend true knowledge that gets rid of that avidya. So we are stuck in the cycle of birth, death, rebirth because of avidya, which is as eternal as the true reality that lies behind it, according to the Advait Vedantic interpretation. And in breaking through that Maya, being able to see beyond the veil of Maya, we are able to find freedom. Why that takes place, why does Maya exist in the first place, how come it's eternal? The Vedic teachings are silent on some of these questions about the origin of Maya, the eternality of Maya. They're simply posited as logical conclusions by certain interpreters like Adi Shankara. For Adi Shankara, Maya it had to have existed as eternally as the Brahman would. Otherwise, there is no reason for the Brahman to create Maya. These are the different points on which the different schools differ, but the unity that lies behind the apparent plurality is the main teaching of the Upanishads. The different schools, the different Astika schools, don't exactly take up this aspect of the Upanishadic teachings, because they don't all consider the Upanishads to be the main authoritative text, or the main text that they want to focus on to develop their own school of thought. Like, for example, Purva Mimamsa, which is the earlier part of that deals with the earlier part of the Vedas, the Karam Kand, the Samhitas and the Brahmanas, is not entirely interested in what the Upanishads have to say, because its focus is on the mantras and the primacy of sound and shabd. To say that it is in sound and in shabd, which is testimony, and in the mantras, that anything to do with liberation and bondage is to be found. that there is no gyan or knowledge to be sought. It's to be found in the injunctions of the mantras. The mantras are telling you what to do. You just have to follow them in a sense. And that also leads to the ashrama system of brahmacharya, grihasti, vanprasthi, and sannyas. That you begin as a student, you become a householder, and as a householder you continue to do certain rituals and practices, and then when you seclude yourself into a forest, which is the vanprasthi section. The aranyakas that I mentioned of the Vedas come from the vanprasth sages, the ascetics. Their work is now dealing more with the philosophical nature of things, but according to Purva Mimamsa, as long as they're following the mantras, they're following the shabd, the testimony, liberation will be found. So when we study the Vedas as Vedantins, as Advait Vedantins, we can consider it to be self-evident that this teaching of monism, of absolute monism, is self-evidently the only teaching that the Vedas have to offer. And interpretations on the nature of reality, whether it's dual, whether it's singular, that's a secondary matter, but absolute unity of Brahman is the true teaching. This may seem self-evident to us now that 3,000 years of discourse on these topics has taken place. So, like Sir also said, that we cannot read history without understanding the socio-politics that leads to the development of certain schools of thought. In that process, there is conflict, there is appropriation, there is misrepresentation of the other, there is co-option of their central tenets, and as readers of philosophy, as readers of history, we have to always keep that in mind, that the nature of these schools of thought was one of great internal conflict and co-option and the like. That the neat classifications of these different schools as we understand them now is something of an anachronistic reading. That the Nyaya-Vaisheshika school and Buddhist schools, they were in great conflict. They were also trying to adopt each other's strongest points and then dismiss each other. Similarly with Mimamsa, some would argue that Kumarilla Bhattacharya was the Mimamsic teacher who was able to push out Buddhism from India. But that's an oversimplification that ignores the sheer influence that Buddhism had on these schools to begin with. So it's a tradition. It's a philosophical tradition with 9 different schools, in particular the 3 Nastika and the 6 Astika. But the classification of them as if they were these independent schools is a false one. There was a great deal of turmoil between them, of sociopolitics that spans from 1500 BCE, when the Rigveda is composed, to the coming of the Buddha and Mahavir Jain in the 7th and 6th century BCE, to the different developments over the Bhakti movement. The Bhakti movement also laid the foundations for the Vedantic interpretations of the Upanishads later on. The Gita and its teachings brought back the primacy of gods and devotion, which was being critiqued by the Upanishads. So you see a lot of these movements within the development of these schools of thought. Also, the ethics that are promoted, this is a minor point, but still interesting to note, that the ethics promoted not only come from a certain conception of the self and our responsibilities to the other, but we must remember, and you all especially as law students, that there were not formal structures of redressal and judiciary back then. So ethics ends up dealing more with a focus on individual duties rather than an assertion of rights, because rights require certain institutions to be able to safeguard them. So the socio-political context of the times also very much so determines the philosophy that is being created, that is originating in those times. To do a brief recap of how consciousness is explained in some of the Upanishads. In the Chandogya Upanishad and the Mandukya Upanishad, it's done via the different layers of consciousness through sleeping from waking to dreaming to dreamless sleep to Turiya. This is also symbolized by the Om symbol, where the Aum sound starts from the Jagrat A to the O, which is the sleeping, to the which is the dreamless sleep, and the silence that follows afterwards is the Turiya stage. That silence that follows afterward, the Turiya stage, is not given to the intellect. It's not given to direct apprehension. It's only given to intuitive experience, and that is promoted via certain meditative activities. The authority of the Vedas does not necessarily mean that the different schools agree upon what the Vedas have to say, like we just discussed. It is the Vedantic schools that focus on the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and the Gita. The Brahma Sutras were by Badarayan the first systematization of the main teachings of the Upanishads, and are considered to be part of the Vedantic canon of teaching. The real self which illumines consciousness is not given in consciousness, it's beyond consciousness. In Buddhist teachings, this idea of something being beyond the conscious experience it's a very significant part of the practical element of Buddhist teachings, which wants to not deal with extensive metaphysics and wants to deal with certain goals that you can achieve within your life, certain attributes, certain virtues that you should develop, and it's silent on certain metaphysical concepts such as, does the universe exist eternally? Is there life after death? The Buddha would simply say that these issues are not relevant for the achievement of nirvana. That there are other concepts, that there are other ways of being that have a greater relevance. It's the example that I used yesterday was it's like being struck with an arrow, and instead of removing the arrow, one is concerned more with the nature of its make, whether it's wood, whether it's metal, so on and so forth. So what true knowledge constitutes and how we can reach it, these different schools of thought differ in that. But the Buddhist school in particular is silent on a lot of the metaphysical questions. Is not to say that the metaphysical questions aren't taken up by subsequent Buddhists, but the Buddha in his own teachings remains silent on these in favor of certain practical concerns. And like I mentioned earlier, for something to be beyond the realms of thought, beyond the realms of cognition, it's a recurring theme in Buddhist thought that nirvana, samsara, all of these concepts, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, that they're all beyond the realms of cognition, and we can only think in the categories of what is real, unreal, both real and unreal, or neither real nor unreal. Real, unreal, both real and unreal, neither real nor unreal. It's also called the Chatushkoti. And with these four categories, you have exhausted the limits of thought. If something is beyond the limits of thought, then thought itself cannot apprehend it. So the real self which illumines consciousness is not in consciousness. The real self is beyond the manifesting self. And that is where the primacy of meditation and direct experiences come in. So in today's session, we have discussed the Vedic and Upanishadic thought in some detail, the ideas of Brahman, Atman, Avidya, and Maya, and how the different schools of thought, especially in Vedantic schools that develop after 8th century CE with Adi Shankara's Advait Vedanta, Ramanuja's Vashisht Advait, Madhvacharya's Dvait. We didn't go into the particulars of it, but we discussed that they disagree on matters of whether Maya is real or not, whether the Brahman truly manifests itself or whether it's merely an appearance. Those seemingly minor points of difference lead to these different schools of thought coming about altogether. But it's Advait Vedanta, which is considered by many in the modern revivalist, modern revivalism of classical Hindu philosophy, that it truly captures the central teachings of the Vedas. Swami Vivekananda in particular was an Advait Vedantin. And when we study the different Vedantic interpretations of the Upanishads, we find that the Vashishta Dvait and Dvait depend upon a form of bhakti. The Vashishta Advait school had been influenced by and also influenced the Vaishnavite traditions, but the Advait school dealt with pure monism, and the Mukhya Upanishads are interpreted as all leading to that pure monism. That there is, if there is all unity, if there's all oneness as the essence of reality, that even our understanding of our distinction from that true reality is the final obstacle in true understanding. That we are not separate from it either. That it's not that we are drops and that is an ocean, but we are drops within the ocean. We simply believe that we are separate from the ocean, but we are drops within it. And once we understand that nature, we can merge into the ocean and forget our illusory notion of difference. So thank you all for being present today, and I will open up our question and answer round. Thank you very much.
Everyone who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat box any place that through which I can know that you want to ask a question. That would be great. Before that, I had a question myself, Asad.
Yes, please.
So we talked about the idea of Atman and Brahman, and I found that these ideas of objectivity and subjectivity keep coming up again and again. So like, how do they, like, I actually don't want to mix up, given the Western ideas of objectivity and subjectivity that we have. What is the relationship, would you say, and how do we differentiate between these Western ideas of objectivity and subjectivity and the idea of Brahman and Atman?
Right. So in the Western notions of objectivity and subjectivity, and since we are having a discourse in English, we risk falling into certain Western interpretations, and that is a trick. That is definitely a challenge in trying to separate these terms, which are used in a very different way in the Indian context. In the Western context, an object is something the object is something that is apprehended, and the subject is the one apprehending. In the Indian philosophical context, in the Upanishadic context, it is to say that the Brahman and the Atman are that which create consciousness, are that which create subjectivity. So they themselves cannot be objects to be apprehended. That Brahman is, in a sense, the same word for Atman, but outside of yourself, the provisional self. You are, in a way, the provisional self between the Brahman on the one hand and the Atman on the other hand, which turn out to be the same thing. The Atman is the pure consciousness that lies behind your consciousness. It is the Brahman made conscious. So consciousness is, and subjectivity is a defining feature of that Atman that lies behind your consciousness, that lies behind all consciousness, but it is undifferentiated like the Brahman. So the two terms, they are used to lead one to unity. So even using the two terms separately may make it seem like they're different things, but the Upanishads constantly also use them interchangeably to show that Brahman is the unconscious absolute unity of things, and Atman is the conscious absolute unity of thing hiding behind our provisional self. It is not a matter of differentiation. It's a matter of looking beyond the veil of Maya, that you apprehend the true self behind your apparent self, and you realize that the true self was the Brahman. It was the undifferentiated hiding behind you. And why does the Atman reside behind the provisional self in the realm of Maya and the empirical realm? These are some of the things on which the Vedantic schools differ. In some cases, the empirical realm is completely illusory. In some cases, the empirical realm is real, and the Atman is a reflection of the Brahman, or the Atman is something that resides within the realm of Maya to guide you, for you to realize. It's like the reflection of the sun in the water, and it's wanting you to look at the sun. The way these are explained is often through metaphor, through dialogue, because the limits of language are shown in the matters of understanding.
Yeah, that is certainly true. Thanks a lot. Please, anyone else who
Can
has a
we
question?
say, Asad, that can we say, Asad, in this way, that the difference more in Indian logic, and if we have to compare, then Indian logic doesn't have that concept for variables. So Indian logic has no variables as such, as is the tendency in Western philosophy that we used to have variables. So different variety of logic, if we will say accustomed to, I mean, like in the West, we look to have various types of variables for the purpose of logic, whereas in Indian context, we are not having variables as such. So our tendency is notably intentional, whereas the Western philosophy or Western logic predominantly is extensional in nature.
Right. So I think one way of addressing that statement is that by setting up an ontological status of Brahman as something which is unified and that all reality is unified, we are constantly put into suspicion about difference. And if difference is illusory, then these variables do not exist. So if we are following the Upanishadic Vedantic premise of there being a unified eternal Brahman, then we are believing in a kind of unity and rejecting all appearance of plurality. So our logic is also, if we are using that as our main school, but Nyaya does not deal so much so with unity. It accepts plurality, and Nyaya is the logical school. If we are using Nyaya logic in the Upanishadic context, how that would appear is a very interesting question, and I'm not entirely sure, because Nyaya logic is pluralistic. It deals with objects that one can apprehend. It has different theories of error that acknowledge plurality in the world, while error in the Vedantic sense is one that is simply caused by Maya. So the Khyativad, which is the error, the schools of error, the modes of understanding error, they differ from different schools as well. In the Advaita Vedantic school, the errors is simply called the Anirvachaniya Khyati, which is that all error of perception is simply an error of taking things presented to us by Maya as real. So in a way, it's a very direct, somewhat simplistic understanding of error. While in the more pluralistic logical schools, which accept objects as being real out there, they may accept more variables. So this whole Western and Indian distinction, even within the Indian context, there is so much plurality in how logic is applied to the material world. Whether objects exist or not varies from the belief systems of different schools.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anyone else who has a question?
Yeah, sir, I wanted a bit. We discussed something about individualism and the importance or the supposed understanding that we have, that the path to spirituality according to Indian philosophy, and that is concentrated around individualism. But that is, as you said, it is a it is a very surface level, or it is a wrong understanding that it is concerned around individualism. But I think it has a connected notion with the understanding that you talk about, that if a person supposes that person has gained enlightenment and then holds on to that enlightenment, that is also a kind of fetter to the complete journey that he or she must attain. That is also expressed in, if I'm correct, in the book Autobiography of a Yogi. He's written about that some gurus that he went to attained some siddhis in their path to enlightenment through their meditation, and they stuck onto those siddhis, so they could not go continue on that path of attaining moksha or like that. So, and another story that connects here, which just came to me, like when Buddha attained enlightenment, and he was told that he should spread the knowledge that he has gained to everyone. He talked about, he said that people are not capable enough to accept the knowledge that I have gained. So from that, I think these two notions are connected. Like, how do you because it applies to our practical life also, like how do you mark the distinction of like seeing yourself in everyone and everyone in yourself, but then also realizing the fact that maybe a lot of people would not be capable enough to grasp this knowledge. And in the practical sense also, these days when people are not really concerned about philosophies and how to lead life, and more concerned on the materialistic aspects of life. So I don't think I could formulate my question pretty well, but if you just understood what I want
No,
to
no,
ask,
absolutely.
and further
It was
discussion
all
on
very
this. Yes.
lucid. No problem at all. One of the problems with talking about there is no way for one to test the true realization or enlightenment of the other. If it is beyond language, it is purely subjective. So there are a lot of these gaps in how we understand these different concepts. Like if someone were to gain siddhi, and if they were to have direct intuitive experience with Atman, which has caused Jivan Mukti, and they will now have Videha Mukti after they die. How is third person to know whether they are not simply regurgitating the teachings of the Vedas as given in words, and whether they have had such a direct experience at all, whether such a direct experience even exists, whether the Atman even exists, whether it is simply a subjective um, interpretation put on some element of meditative experience. These are the critical questions that we have to ask. When we are discussing the Upanishads and Vedas, we are mostly just doing an exposition. We are just, here we're just explaining what these texts are saying. But critically, we can interrogate them to say that there are untestable premises um, to direct experience. So if direct experience in itself um, is not given to language, then how can any discourse on direct experience even be believed? These are some of the ways in which we can problematize the and we can problematize these teachings and see them from a critical lens. But if we accept the teachings as they are, uh, and see that there is a certain uh, individualistic path to liberation that also wants to incorporate others, then one can accept one of the many different schools and find that in some schools it is, for example, in the Theravada Buddhism schools, salvation is individualistic. It is about you finding your salvation, because the problem is your reincarnation. The problem is you being stuck in the cycle of life, death, rebirth. In the Mahayana school, it is to say that the ethical aspect of suffering is expanded, that not only should you be concerned with your cycle of birth, death, rebirth, but you should be concerned with that of others as well. That in letting go of your own desires and your own ignorance, since you can help others, that is the greatest ethical um, action that you can do. This is also the ought can binary, that if you can do something, you ought to do it. That if you can help assist others in their path to liberation, then you ought to do it. But in modern Western um, ethical theory, there's a great question on what justifies the ought can division. Like, just because you can do something, why should you do it? Why should you be ethical? That is a philosophical problem, just speaking about it from a Western philosophical perspective. There is something self-evident to ethics, but also there is a lack of justification of why ethics should be the primary goal and not one's own individual liberation. It really depends upon which school of thought you're adhering to. And the question that you had asked actually touches upon a much broader debate within the branch of ethical philosophy of how do we justify ethics? Why be ethical? Why not just focus on your own liberation? So these are unfortunately, there's no clear answer to any of that, and it kind of depends upon the different philosophers, schools of thought that you're reading. The one that makes the strongest case for it may be doing so without believing ethics to be self-evident, by simply believing it to be the good that you can cause, and the good having a certain value in alleviating suffering. And if suffering is something that's negative, then you should extend it to others. But why be ethical is a philosophical problem. It's not conclusive.
Right. Thank you so much, sir.
Can I make a observation here? If Asad, you allow me to say, I just want to say one thing, that when we talk of Buddhism and when we compare with the earlier text, the major difference also is one, that in the previous in the case of Upanishads, when we say that salvation can be transformed, I mean, the moment you are aware of, you are enlightened. So that thing is that information or that knowledge has to be given to the worthy, and that worthy class was fixed to some extent.
Yeah,
so it means it was exclusionary. Whereas in the case of Buddhism, he was not saying that you are not reaching. It is when it comes to Buddhism that who will be the higher of Buddha. So there he was searching for the worthy fellow. Otherwise, he was not searching for the worthy fellow. His information or his knowledge is for everybody. And whomsoever is going to attain, I mean, it will be individualistic, as you are saying, that becomes an individual phenomena. But it was not placed within any caste structure as such.
It was not
so
restricted to the caste. Yes.
Exactly. So that difference is there, that it therefore reaches to the mass. And therefore, at that time, in that moment, people started coming into it. And this is also one of the reasons that when later, as a counter-revolution, later Upanishad text or Vedanta philosophy developed, it developed around this era. And therefore, it was more politicized because of that Buddha movement.
Yes, in fact, the Buddhism and Jainism were these schools of thought that were led by ethics much more than metaphysics. One can say that the Upanishads are led by a certain metaphysics, and the ethics become a secondary component to them. The Jain and Buddhist schools are led by an ethics that also include doctrines of salvation, but the ethical element of it is right at the forefront. And in legitimizing themselves, the Upanishadic scholars constantly adopted the ethical aspects of Buddhism and Jainism. In fact, by certain accounts, the vegetarianism that is now associated with Hinduism came from adopting adopting the Buddhist
Buddhism, true.
because they were clearly showing certain ethical tenets that were being ignored or overlooked by the Upanishadic scholars. And in the vying for power, the vying for influence in courts, they were losing because of some of those ethical gaps.
True. And this is what the politics of that time was, that they had started incorporating various other dominant religions of that time, so that they look like more contemporary and they will look more like accommodating. Yes. So this is the reason why Buddhism was shown as one of the avatars.
Absolutely. That's a very clear example of co-option. It shows that that there was this vying for influence that is trying to take the best elements of something else while trying to cover its own flaws, whatsoever may exist from an ethical point of view, from a metaphysical point of view. The different Astika schools were constantly in conversation with each other. The ethical aspect is that which we can point out, with the most force, because ethics are are the backbone of living in society in such a strong way. It's not our metaphysics that determine how we treat each other as much as our ethics determining how we treat each other. But in the mutual influence, conflict, co-option of these schools, it went from metaphysics to logic to ethics of how they were trying to incorporate one from the other.
True. Thanks.
Thank you.
Asad, also one observation that I had, and a sort of question as well, from our discussion on Maya, how, Maya is something that is out there, and the unity that lies beyond the Maya is something that we are trying to reach, if I'm putting it correctly.
Yes.
So I sort of noticed a very like a similar theme that runs across Western philosophy as well. When we look at the philosophy of Plato, where he puts appearance as something that is subservient to the idea or the form. So I'm curious as to the way that we are looking at Maya, and the way that Plato and other Platonic philosophers looked at appearance. Is there a sort of what is the comparison that we can draw between these two sort of ideas?
Actually, the strongest comparison that can be made is with Plato's forms. So that's very well pointed out. And the critique of Plato's forms by Aristotle and others in the peripatetic school was that it creates an ontology that is neither mind dependent nor objectively real in space and time. So we understand the ontology, or the ontology being another word for metaphysics. We understand the nature of being of something as being either in space and time as a material reality, or being in the mind as a concept. But for Plato's forms, for him, the forms were that which represented universals. So if there is a beautiful sunset, and if there is a beautiful flower, then there is something about beauty that exists over and above these two very different particulars. If a flower can be beautiful and a sunset can be beautiful, then what is it that lends beauty to both of them? So Plato's conceptualization of the forms for him was a matter of conceptualizing universals from which the particulars flow. And the world of appearances is then made secondary to the world of universals. But for Plato, there was an individual form of each thing. There was a form of beauty and a form of this. So the forms were differentiated, even if the realm of the forms was a realm of the universals. And the critique that comes from that for someone like Aristotle is that then is there a form of forms? So we're going into a very like a very abstract territory here, but for Plato, the forms were. That's a very good question. Can we talk about Plato's allegory with Maya? I'll get to that in just a moment. Thank you. So for Plato's forms, they were an objective realm with differentiation within. The Brahman that lies beyond Maya in the Upanishadic view is undifferentiated. It's the Maya which creates differentiation. So unlike the forms, the Brahman is undifferentiated, but like appearances, Maya creates plurality and particulars. So there is some parallel there.
I think,
and in the allegory, yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear what you just said. Could you repeat that, please?
I was just saying that, okay, so the sort of comparison that we're making, a more appropriate one that would be to draw the comparison with Neoplatonist philosophers who sort of took Plato's concept of forms and divided it into three layers. One is the foundation, which is the unity, and from there the forms flow, and from there the world of appearances lie. So there's a three-tiered structure of reality that is constructed. So I think that corresponds with the single unity that we're talking about in relation to Maya, and the appearance that just sort of exists out there, to us. So I think that is a more apt like parallel to draw if we wanted to.
Absolutely. The Neoplatonists, they benefited from the critiques given by Aristotle, so they could correct some of those those problems about how the forms are conceptualized. And Maya, in terms of the allegory of the cave, there is a very clear parallel there, because the allegory of the cave is one of appearances versus true reality that hides behind it. Maya here is something like, instead of the cave, it's like the entire world is the cave. The allegory is that the entire world is like the cave of Plato, and Maya exists eternally the way Brahman exists eternally. And Maya is leading you to believe that this world is the real world, and that is the veil of ignorance that you have. That is the ignorance that you that binds you to birth, death, and rebirth. If you are able to see beyond that veil of Maya, that is when you realize the Atman. You realize that you are not your provisional self or your given empirical consciousness, that you are the Atman. That and Atman is the Brahman, so you are the Brahman. And then your existence in the empirical realm ends with that. That is the doctrine of salvation.
Okay, sir, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any final questions before we conclude for today? Also, the pramans that were mentioned earlier, they do not play a particularly big role in the Upanishadic schools. The Upanishadic thought and the Vedantic schools, they play a greater role in the other Astika schools like Nyaya-Vaisheshika that deal with logic and epistemology. But they are important. They are important in terms of, if knowledge is that which is our greatest goal, then how do we differentiate knowledge from false beliefs? And then you have a theory of right cognition that comes in. But this cognition, if it is within the empirical realm, like Sir mentioned, that there are no variables, there is no belief in objective plurality in the Upanishadic thought. So the use of logic vis-a-vis variables will exist in schools more so that believe in plurality, like the Nyaya-Vaisheshika.
Thanks, Asad. I think it's over. It's over for the day.
Yeah. Thank you very much to all who were present.
Thanks once again.
Thanks a lot, Asad. We'll be looking forward to tomorrow's finale of our lecture series with the lecture on Jain, Buddhist, and Karvak schools. You will be sent another mail with the link for tomorrow. And thank you everyone for joining. And we'll send a recording of this lecture on the same thread, a pre-edited recording. As we said in the mail, that we'll be, after doing all the necessary editing, we'll be uploading a final version of all these recordings on our YouTube channel, which will be sent to you on the mail as well. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.